"This doesn't seem right," Crix murmured. "You could house a dozen unblooded in here." "Or the pair of us," responded Mira. She sank onto the room's lone extended couch, positioned directly across from an enormous floor-to-ceiling window, and flinched a bit. Even the Solarian doctor's finest work hadn't been able to completely restore the fractured bone. The elegant Xyloth exhibited additional indications of deterioration as well. Mara was breathing heavily, following the short journey from the elevator to their new living space. Her countenance appeared sunken and drawn, and her coat had not yet recovered its former sheen. These symptoms, however, were not a result of her injury. Crix's initial month of confinement would always be a foggy memory. He had retreated inward following the separation from his pack, grappling with years of ingrained beliefs. It was Mara coming back to the captives with a recovered shoulder and tales of Solarian generosity, who managed to draw him out of his self-imposed seclusion. She had barely returned for 3 days when she became sick. Others quickly came down with it as well. The affliction struck the wounded initially. Valiant fighters were diminished to hollow forms, deteriorating as they rejected sustenance. Clusters of ailing Xyloth gathered in nooks for extended periods, motionless and silent. Some even attempted to end their lives, overcome by an inescapable feeling of futility and anguish. It was solely through the exertions of the unaffected prisoners that the ill were kept from succumbing. The pack leader had attributed the illness to the humans and dismissed their assistance proposals, asking that they allow the captives to manage on their own. Their captors had objected but eventually yielded to the Xyloth's demands. The healthy inmates fell ill one after another. Before long, Crix was the sole person still able to move about. He wasn't certain how he'd managed to keep the encroaching darkness at bay. Perhaps his recently developed hatred for the Vexari propelled him forward. Maybe some part of him refused to let Mara down when she had stood by him. Regardless, he'd persevered until the very end, when desperation had compelled him to seek assistance from the Solarians. Crix had been whisked away by human scientists for tests while hundreds of medical personnel flooded into the Xyloth cells. Their wasting disease had become something of a cause célèbre among the Solarian doctors and xenobiologists. Whatever ethical code had prevented the humans from imposing experiments on their prisoners hadn't stopped them from theorizing. Their primary hypothesis was verified within hours. Crix's pack was experiencing withdrawal. The perpetrator was revealed to be an enhanced variant of the Krillium slave drug, able to create its potent physiological addiction without any visible side effects. A human graduate student who had been casually developing an alien adaptation of contemporary drug rehabilitation programs had his project taken away by seasoned researchers. The Xyloth's treatment began a couple of weeks after. Crix nearly forgot about the drug when the humans presented him with the results of their genetic testing. He had remained silent as an older human woman pointed out numerous clumsily inserted gene sequences, each likely meant to mold his species into someone's concept of an ideal warrior. Neurotransmitters responsible for relaxation and contentment had been impaired, while molecules that enhanced pack loyalty had been rendered nearly addictive. The deterioration of the Xylothan telomere equivalents had been accelerated, limiting their lifespan to just over 30 human years. Areas of the brain necessary for complex reasoning and abstract mathematics had been deprived of the proteins they required to operate, and a completely new nodule had been attached to the brainstem to serve as a basic feedback loop. It triggered unease and dissatisfaction in reaction to extended happiness or pleasure. Collectively, these adjustments rendered the Xyloth ideal cannon fodder, intensely loyal, physically unable to return to civilian life, and with lifespans too brief and limitations too severe to consider rebelling against their Vexari overlords. Crix was so engrossed in pondering the implications that he failed to catch the human researcher's subsequent remarks. "Pardon me?" he'd asked, his eyes widening slightly. "That's quite a bit to process." She had laughed. "I said that we can repair it, that we can make you complete again. Are you up for it?" After nearly a week of discussion, the Xyloth had said yes. Now Crix stood outlined in the doorway, absorbing Mara's gentle growls of pleasure as a bewildering array of choices materialized just above the window's surface. The Solarian sun, starting to dip below the city's towering glass and steel skyline, flooded the room with deep crimson light. He couldn't help but stiffen in anticipation of the familiar idle guilt that had once dominated his existence. It never came. He couldn't tell how much time had passed as he stood there, etching the scene into his memory, but a reproachful look from Mira finally caught his attention. Before long, the two Xyloth were cuddled up together, speaking in hushed tones while viewing a nature program about the diverse bird species of Earth. Tomorrow, thought Crix happily. We can face the galaxy tomorrow. They didn't leave the room for 3 days. Crix exited the building and stepped into the sunlight and breeze. It felt pleasant. His companion hadn't been able to accompany him on his initial outing, though not for want of effort. Mira had managed to reach the lobby before succumbing to fatigue. Crix had assisted her back to their quarters, and then attempted to remain, but she'd urged him to go after extracting a promise to return with some of the Chinese food they'd observed on human culinary programs. She'd also jokingly threatened to toss him out the window if he came back empty-handed. He was determined to find her some noodles and stir-fry. He'd felt quite certain that he could pull it off when he'd made the promise. Now Crix wasn't so confident. He had lived his whole life aboard various Alliance stations, becoming familiar with their strict and unyielding design as he grew older. Everything was tidy and organized and maintained meticulously in its place. This human city was different. For starters, it was teeming with humans. Humans congregating on balconies, humans gathering in the streets, human children darting through the throngs, human musicians saturating the air with incredibly beautiful melodies. There really were a lot of them. Some walked forward purposefully, focused on a personal destination of their own. Others meandered casually, pausing to chat and socialize with their neighbors. There were even groups of humans moving as units across open fields, exhibiting a concerning degree of coordination in their contests against other groups. The Xyloth didn't seem overcrowded despite its population. Rather, the city felt vibrant. Strategically placed mirrors illuminated the numerous parks and walkways that occupied the wide spaces between towering buildings. Fountains and blossoms gave the atmosphere a light, airy quality, while clusters of trees lent the paths their own grandeur. Thoughtfully positioned sculptures and stages completed the scene with a subtle touch of art and culture. Taken together, it was beautiful, isn't it? Crix started. He hadn't noticed the human male walk up alongside him. The man extended a hand and Crix shook it. He had learned that much from his recent television marathon. Noticing the Xyloth's bewilderment at his gesture, the human began to speak. I'm Al. Local militia CO wants me to make sure you don't get lost. And to keep me out of trouble? Nope, we already have folks handling that. Believe me, you'd prefer to stay happily oblivious about people. Crix looked up at the countless balconies and windows overhead. His recent encounter with human snipers remained vivid in his memory. No, the Xyloth thought with a shudder. I likely don't. Anyhow, Al went on, I thought I'd start by getting you something to eat. You received the usual food compatibility procedure when they removed those slave mods of yours, didn't you? The Xyloth gave a nod. Human physicians had confirmed to him that creating the genetic code for enzymes capable of digesting Solarian cuisine was straightforward, and both he and Mira had eagerly accepted the opportunity. Nothing these two-legged beings prepared could possibly be less appetizing than pack rations. Al grinned broadly. Excellent. We'll grab a grill and I'll make you a steak. The prepackaged food we put in new rooms is terrible. They made their way down into one of the parks and moved towards a small structure nestled between two tall oaks. A compact outdoor kitchen extended from one wall as Al approached. Crix found himself salivating while his human guide seasoned a pair of enormous slabs of meat. Don't we have to pay someone for this? Not for sustenance. We ceased allowing individuals to go hungry following the Unification War. Currency is solely for luxury items or investment shares. Building shares? 3 days in that room and you couldn't find an orientation brochure? Must have been occupied. Al turned back to the grill and flipped the meat, making Crix's ears twitch with anticipation. The meat smelled delicious. Everyone puts some kind of investment into their home. My share here provides me with a room and a vote on the local council. We borrowed the whole system from the Martians after we noticed how well it worked to jumpstart their terraforming process. What if you can't afford a share? A stint or two in the Navy or Marines will set you straight, and you can progress from there. It's how the majority of folks begin. Signing up isn't strictly required, but it's certainly the quickest route to getting yourself situated. Oh, That was quite a shift from the Alliance's harsh economic system. Why even bother with anything else then? Sorry? Al looked puzzled. Why don't you simply complete your sentence and cease working? How does all of this, Crix said, motioning towards the parks and the little grill, end up here if no one is compelled to do it? Why not? It's enjoyable to go out and be creative. I have a neighbor who spends quite a bit of his spare time down here in the gardens. He and a few other guys are working on creating an arrangement for some competition. They get hours of enjoyment, and we get a lovely floral display. Yet who maintains cleanliness and constructs or labors in the factories and mines? I haven't observed any slaves or servants around. We have machines for that. You might be amazed at how many geeks apply for a chance to tinker with one of the large drilling rigs or a surface-based fabricator. These are among the most coveted positions within the civil engineers. Crix might have continued his inquiries if Al hadn't decided to remove the steaks from the grill just then. The Xyloth shut his eyes in pleasure as he relished the flavorful, well-seasoned meat, making a mental note to bring Mara down here once she had recovered. Perhaps he could even cook the meal for her himself. Al was in the process of putting away the kitchen items when Crix completed his meal and opened his eyes. A hint of amusement could be seen in the human's gaze. Enjoy the food? You've just convinced me to learn to cook. Great. We should get moving, as we've got plenty of distance to cover before dark. Any particular preferences? Mira's going to rip me apart if I don't return with some Chinese food for her. Got a few food enthusiasts in my group. I'll send them a message and ensure there's some ready for you when we return. Now, let's give you a tour of the university. Crix allowed Al to lead him down into the transit tunnels under the streets and into something that brought to mind one of the passenger cars on the Stellaris. No, aboard Nova Hub. Solarians referred to it as Nova Hub. He felt somewhat surprised at the lack of stares he received from the other human riders, but when he questioned Al about it, his guide merely chuckled. We were informed you'd be emerging days ago. Apparently, the higher-ups underestimated how long you folks could indulge in television. The vehicle came to a stop and they exited, ascending from the tunnels and emerging into the daylight. Al made a broad gesture. Welcome to the Interstellar Academy of Zephyria, our most esteemed local institution. I instruct an introductory genetics course here on the weekends. You're both a soldier and a scientist? Crix struggled to imagine how a human could juggle the constant patrols and drills he'd been taught with a scholarly profession. How do you handle the two? Al chuckled once more. It's not particularly challenging. In fact, many of us are quite engaged in activities beyond the military. Al deliberately guided Crix into one of the nearby buildings and entered a lecture hall. The Xyloth paused momentarily before going in after. Crix departed somewhat dazed. They'd shown up late, yet he'd still managed to hear most of the professor's overview of the Xyloth genetic alterations and adjustments. The addition to their brain had been removed, their imbalanced neurotransmitters had been corrected, and their accelerated aging had been returned to normal rates. Better than normal, in fact. The most accurate human estimates suggested they'd managed to triple the Xyloth's natural lifespan, and several laboratories had formed a collaborative group to investigate repairing the existing telomere analog damage. Crix was captivated by the presentation, his recently cleared mind now capable of absorbing the information with a sharpness he'd never imagined possible. He disrupted Al's tour plans by pulling his human guide to several lectures on xenobiology, physics, mathematics, and literature before the frazzled-looking human finally succeeded in stopping his enthusiastic charge. Take it easy there, pal. You can always return tomorrow. There's still one spot that I'd like to show you before we get you back to your partner. But we need to do it now. The tide's coming in. Al guided him back through the tunnels and then out once more. Crix released a choked gasp as he emerged from the tunnel and found himself on a beach. He stepped onto the beach and removed his footwear, savoring the sensation of the warm sand on his furry feet. Crouching at the water's edge, he observed a small crab burying itself in the sand, the tiny creature unaware of his presence. He then moved to a small tidal pool and carefully lifted out a starfish, delicately running a finger across its textured surface. He would be taking Mara here tomorrow even if he needed to carry her. She was bound to love this. Mara was bored. She would be out there with Crix at this moment if it weren't for those accursed slave drugs. A fortnight after the treatment, and she remained as weak as a newborn. Curse those Vexari. She longed to see Earth. She wasn't planning to confine Crix in here with her, though, and she'd required a little time alone to fully investigate the room. When the pair of them had attempted it, they'd consistently found themselves sidetracked. Her former communal living space could have fit into the apartment 2 times over. The majority of the apartment was taken up by an open sitting area, a third of which was occupied by the enormous window screen. The remainder was filled with couches and tables, interrupted only by a few nooks that concealed everything from small bedrooms to a sealed weapons locker to exercise equipment to a well-stocked kitchen. Mara had never cooked, however, and wouldn't know where to begin in preparing a meal. Slaves had always handled that task. Those Vexari certainly kept us well focused, Mara thought with bitterness. She wondered what these humans had in store for them now. She scanned the room for listening devices, attempting to be as comprehensive as possible. It wasn't a particularly effective search. Given the level of technological advancement evident, the humans could conceal a recording device practically anywhere. It had taken Mara nearly half an hour to even figure out how the screen operated. The microcircuitry was virtually indistinguishable from the surrounding crystal. They weren't simply made of beveled glass either. Glass would have broken when she'd thrown one of the small screens against the wall. Not every piece of technology was concealed as gracefully. The food storage units obviously employed Stellarisk stasis technology, though Mara couldn't recall seeing the tiny bubble projectors outside of medical kits, and the gravity field generator beside the free weights might have been taken directly from an Alliance vessel. However, all items of Solarian origin were integrated flawlessly. So any human designs are probably going to be invisible, Mara said, talking out loud to the vacant room. Great. I suppose it'd be too much to hope they'd bug this place with Stellarist technology. She picked up the dropped screen and sank back onto the couch with a sigh. Perhaps she could still discover something worthwhile on the human net. It required a couple of minutes to configure the device for her individual use. Then she connected online and began to browse through the disarray of the Solarian information network. Whatever these humans were, they weren't oppressive. It seemed they had tossed every bit of their shared knowledge onto their net, then somehow managed to keep it all structured. Mira had no difficulty tracking down an open-source bug detector and leasing time on the tower's fabber to create it. Your move, humans. The delivery estimate indicated she had roughly an hour's wait until her new toy arrived. Might as well spend it browsing the net. Mara located a blueprint of her apartment and was astonished to discover it included a balcony. A section of the window slid aside and a small, see-through platform became opaque when she passed her hand over the correct panel. There were even several foldable furniture items stored in a nook within the wall. She moved outdoors. If Crix was allowed to wander about, the minimum she could do was bask in the sunlight. She went back to her aimless browsing of the internet until she came across a coding tutorial forum. One of the guides claimed to create a basic game, so she worked through it. Locating a more artistic community to attempt getting some custom sprites made wasn't too challenging, but it did connect her to some kind of Xyloth discussion group. Initially, she felt thrilled, believing she had discovered a meeting spot for banished Xyloth, but she quickly understood that the posters were all teenage humans. They had begun sharing images, writings, and sketches. The majority of the links and rants were terribly incorrect. She'd be damned if she let them get so many things wrong. Mira found herself engaged in an intense discussion about, among other topics, Xyloth physiology and reproductive behaviors when her doorbell rang. She leapt to her feet, initially assuming it might be Crix, but swiftly recalled that he would have simply entered. She approached the door unhurriedly to answer it. A bashful-looking human woman waited outside, maneuvering a small cart. One of the cart's pair of boxes was evidently her fabber order, while the other displayed the Solarian Navy emblem. I wasn't aware that these were delivered by hand, said Mara. They're not, answered the woman, though this is something of a special case. Also, your snooper would fail to detect some of our more recent bugs. Mara motioned the human in after a short pause of uncertainty. The woman began opening the military transport container while talking at the same time. We've got a simple tap on your net traffic. Nothing fancy, just a scraper for anything public, and caught your Gabber order. Thought we'd lend a hand. She flipped open the case to reveal a small black scanner. This thing will detect everything R&Ds managed to put out except for their damn closed-circuit sleepers. Then you're not bugging us? The human shook her head. No, we aren't. We certainly considered it, but we decided it might send the wrong message. The room ought to be clean. Mara scanned the room before putting the device away, but she still wondered why she even tried. Humans might have programmed both detectors to only give false negatives, and she'd be none the wiser. The Xyloth came back to the deck and began sifting through a guide on basic programming logic. Perhaps she could examine her fabricated scanner, circuit by circuit, and look for signs of interference. How difficult could that be? Mira quickly fell asleep beneath the midday sun and remained that way until Crix nudged her on the shoulder. She then sat up abruptly, feeling a blend of embarrassment and excitement. Her partner was positioned on the deck, ears perked with enjoyment. Crix had tracked down a collection of dining furniture and stacked it with the appetizing Chinese cuisine she'd requested he bring. He began speaking before she could utter a word. My guide appeared rather displeased upon learning we'd been consuming only the ration packs in here. He contacted a few of his squad mates to prepare us something fresh. Crix motioned back inside where 3 carts were brimming with food stasis boxes. It set off something of a chain reaction. Mira released a joyful growl, all notions of intrigue and espionage slipping away. There would be ample time for concern later. At this moment, her pup had returned, and everything felt just right. Stellaris Alliance Healthcare didn't encompass services like post-battle xylothin rehabilitation within its range of treatments. In fact, it hardly dealt with rehabilitation whatsoever. You were either affluent enough to recuperate privately, fit enough to perform your duties, or deceased. It's what happens when a pair of your most influential member species developed from lone hunters. The Vexari and the Saurok didn't have much patience for the disabled. Crix and Mara weren't impacted by the absence of Alliance-sponsored rehabilitation initiatives. They were on Earth. Rather, they'd become casualties of an unusual oversight. Neither of them had ever heard the word wheelchair before. Mira hadn't been particularly eager about being, as she described it, hauled around like some spineless glib, but Crix had eventually convinced her. Now the pair of them were at last venturing through the city together. She appeared impressed by the expansive parks and gardens. They maintain all this without slaves? Indeed, though many gardeners engage in activities beyond just tending to flowers. Humans appear to take pleasure in acquiring knowledge about as many diverse professions as they can. Wouldn't that hurt their soldiering? Not from what we've seen. Mara released an anxious growl. Neither of them ever wished to encounter a human marine again. A line of uniformed humans were walking along one of the paths, moving with mechanical precision. Mara turned to observe them pass, while Crix used the moment to watch Mara. Her coat was beginning to regain its previous sheen, and her emaciated body was gradually recovering. She would be back in peak condition in a matter of weeks. Well, in a matter of weeks if she didn't overexert herself. Crix wasn't certain he could prevent her from rushing forward. His most promising approach was to keep her occupied with the city. Good thing Nebula City was big. Crix led Mara to a secluded grill in the park and began to unfold the metal cooker. She watched with clear skepticism. Since when did you cook? My guide showed me yesterday. I've been itching to try ever since. Know what you're doing? I think so. It's not too difficult. Crix didn't bring up the numerous articles and videos he'd glanced over after Mara had drifted off. She'd only be concerned that he was exhausted. Crix prepared and cooked the meat with relative ease, and observing Mara enjoy a succulent steak more than compensated for the sleep he'd missed. What's our next destination? Mara inquired. Her gaze lingered on an uneaten morsel of meat on Crix's plate with evident desire. We'll stay here. A few professors from the nearby university suggested meeting us for a casual conversation. Crix's ears flicked with amusement as Mara leaned over and grabbed his leftover steak. Their visitors showed up not long after. Mara promptly secluded herself with the computing and electrical engineering instructors, initiating a quick exchange that Crix was unable to comprehend. He conversed with a few biologists and physicists instead. While departing, one of the programmers discreetly passed a small black pouch to Mara. Crix shot her an inquisitive look. What's that? Bug sniffer. It's a long story. Any further questioning was cut off by a passerby's interruption. Excuse me, but have you ever met one of the Hydrani? Crix didn't see any reason to withhold a response. I believe one of them officiated a station-wide ceremony back on the Valor. But aside from that, no. They tend to keep to themselves. Shame. They're truly quite intriguing, you know. Fascinating social structure. Remarkable creatures. The man gazed at Crix. Of course, you'd be more familiar with that than I would. Can't say I do. Now, if you'd... But how could you not? They're wonders. Not many sea creatures can venture into space, but the Hydrani did. Began by weaving their small nets, wound up at the center of a galactic network. Incredibly disciplined, too. The Inquirer obstructed Crix's way as the Nykra attempted to move past him. Yeah, I've never seen a glib go against the grain. I really ought to... Indeed, that's one way of describing it. Unwavering loyalty to whichever elder butted them off. They only reproduce when they've secured territory too, so the younger ones are constantly pushing to expand. Made space exploration almost unavoidable. Of course, that's all somewhat beside the point. I'm more intrigued by the signs of deliberate suppression of certain technological developments. Crix bodily shifted the short human to one side. Intriguing, I'm certain, but we really need to leave. We're already behind schedule. The pair of Xyloth practically dashed for the transit tunnel. Upon entering, Crix sank into his seat with a sense of relief. Thought he'd talk all day. The journey to the arena was brief. Al stood at the platform, holding 2 heavy jackets sized for Nitra. You're cutting it rather close. The game starts in 15. Put these on and come with me. Mara glanced over at Crix as she slipped into her jacket. Puck? All I know is that we're watching a hockey game. Al suggested it. Their guide escorted them into the arena via a side entrance, avoiding the huge crowd pushing through the main doors. They reached their booth moments before the game began. Mara gazed down at the ice as the match started. How are the players gliding around on that? It resembles a large frozen pond. Crix had found an article about the sport. Seems they attach blades to their feet, allows them to move around without slipping. Weird. Which team do we want to win? The team in white is the home side. According to this, they're currently on a 4-game winning streak. A crunch reverberated across the enormous arena, and Mara released a yelp of shock. Crix looked up. What? One of the players was just smashed into the boards. It sounded like a vessel collided with him. What sort of protective gear are these guys wearing? Crix looked down again. No armor, just a bit of lightweight foam padding. They've been playing this way for centuries. That would have killed either of us. These humans are insane. The 2 Xyloth flinched as another resounding crash echoed. Crix anticipated the skater would collapse back onto the ice, but he didn't even falter. He simply continued chasing after the little black puck. Crix was uncertain about his feelings towards the sport, but Mara adored it. By the end of the first period, she had joined in with the crowd's cheers and boos. The home squad was defeated in extra time. Mara felt enraged as they exited the venue. We should have had that. Damn refs were blind. How would you know? You hadn't even heard of hockey this morning. Mara gestured at her tiny display. Discovered a news group. They weren't pleased with some of those decisions. Well, glad you enjoyed it. Next stop's going to... just as fun. The sun remained elevated when they arrived at the beach. The tide had just started to rise. Mara was at a loss for words. How's something like this even possible? Crix shrugged. The moon, I think. Sure is nice. You can say that again. Mara got up from her chair and settled into the cozy sand. This beats the station by a mile. Crix sat down beside her. The pair of Xyloth hardly stirred until the sea was touching their feet. It took them 6 days to become weary of the city. They explored art galleries, museums, and libraries. They were amazed by animals and sea creatures housed in the city's aquarium and zoo. And they attended another 2 hockey games, Mara insisted. But after 6 days of leisure, both Mara and Crix began to feel restless. On the 7th day, they rejoined the fight.
You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel. And for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.